The abundance of revolutionary upheavals is a hallmark of the last century. One of the 20th century revolutions, the scientific and technological one, allowed many fateful historical events to be recorded with great accuracy, especially thanks to the new type of film recording. Perhaps the greatest value, if only due to their scarcity, is represented by footage from the time of the Civil War. Russia, the Forgotten Years, the Civil War, Part 1. The Civil War began shortly after the October coup of 1917. The coup itself was almost bloodless. However, the Civil War became one of the most tragic chapters in the country's history. It was a time of unprecedented violence and cruelty, when the nascent democracy was completely swept away. A small group of Bolshevik revolutionaries, having come to power, skillfully tried to consolidate their hold on the captured stronghold. Those who tried to stop them believed that the Bolsheviks would lead the country to disaster. In the struggle between the Bolsheviks and their opponents, millions of Russians died, and hundreds of thousands of the nation's elite left the country forever. Of course, the Civil War has a long prehistory. For centuries, the vast majority of the Russian Empire's inhabitants endured severe hardships. Russian peasants were bound to the land from time immemorial and forced to work for landowners. In the 19th century, only in two so-called civilized countries, the USA and Russia, did the law allow one person to own another and force them to work against their will. Despite Alexander II's abolition of serfdom in 1861, until the Stolypin Reform of 1906, almost all peasants remained landless, illiterate, and lived in abject poverty. Nicholas II, who became emperor at the end of the 19th century, refused to notice the growing societal desire for radical change. He continued to rule as an autocrat, but was marked by fatal indecisiveness. Numerous internal problems were exacerbated by the World War that began in 1914, and especially by a series of serious military defeats for Russia. By 1916, many Russians were convinced that the country could not be saved without revolutionary changes, and in 1917, Russia experienced two revolutions. The first, the February Revolution, was called the Revolution of Queues. It was a result of the people's despair and disillusionment, and their complete distrust of the government and the Tsar. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. Soon he and his family were placed under arrest. In Petrograd, the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies was formed. It mainly included representatives of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. At the same time, the Provisional Committee of the State Duma appointed the first public cabinet of ministers, headed by Prince Lvov. Milyukov headed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Bolsheviks did not play a significant role in the February Revolution, nor did they expect it. But they would be able to take advantage of the freedoms brought by the revolution better than other parties. In April, Vladimir Ulyanov, a man destined to play a key role in subsequent events, arrived in Russia from Switzerland via Germany, Sweden, and Finland. He was known as Ilyin, Tulin, Petrov, Frey, but the most famous pseudonym was Lenin. A month passed, and the provisional government lost the support of the people. Bolshevik propaganda undermined the authority of the legitimate power. The government lost its ability to maintain public order. Anti-war agitation was highly effective. Although the war continued in the spring of 1917, fraternization between Russian and German soldiers became more frequent at the front. Peasants in soldiers' uniforms no longer wanted to kill each other. By summer, the authority of the military command had completely collapsed, and mass desertion from the front began. Never before had Russian villages and cities been flooded with so many armed people. In early June, delegates of the First Congress of Soviets in Petrograd heard Lenin's statement about the Bolsheviks' intention to seize power. Soon, anti-war demonstrations began in Petrograd, triggered by news of a planned large-scale offensive by the Russian army. The government was forced to restore order using troops. The brutal suppression of demonstrations and the failure of the Russian offensive led to the resignation of the head of government, Prince Lvov. He was replaced by Alexander Kerensky, a well-known lawyer and socialist who was very popular at the time. Who would have thought that less than a year later, fleeing from the Bolsheviks, Kerensky would board a British cruiser with a Serbian passport and leave Russia forever? The commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Lovre Kornilov, believed that Russia's interests required a more decisive and tough policy than that pursued with Kerensky. In August, Kornilov attempted to establish a military dictatorship in the country. However, he failed to seize power. Kornilov's loyal troops were disarmed, and the general himself was arrested. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks gained more supporters, especially in major cities. They developed a plan to seize power. The Petrograd Soviet created a military revolutionary committee which controlled the Red Guard units, the Baltic Fleet, the Petrograd garrison, and other regular troops. Their time came in October. The uprising began in the capital, St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd during the war. The main target of the revolutionaries' attack was the Winter Palace, recently the Tsar's Palace, now the residence of the provisional government. A week before the coup, rumors of a planned palace seizure spread through the city. Previously, the approaches to it were not guarded, but now wooden barricades were hastily erected around the Winter Palace. It was a weak defense, especially since the palace was guarded by inexperienced cadets and a women's battalion. The Bolsheviks, based in Smolny, by this time had not only more people but also more determination and confidence in their cause. On October 25th, they attacked the Winter Palace and captured it quite easily. This event was not filmed. Only on October 30th did documentary filmmakers make the first recording of the Winter Palace and the damage inflicted there. On this day, a battle near Gatchina took place, which can be considered the beginning of the Civil War. The Reds managed to defeat the Cossacks trying to break into Petrograd. Cossack General Pyotr Krasnov was arrested but soon released on parole. Within a week, Soviet power was almost bloodlessly established in nearly all of Russia. But sometimes the Bolsheviks met with energetic resistance. For example, in Moscow, cadets loyal to the provisional government occupied the Kremlin, the Duma building, and other buildings in the city center. Cadets from the Alexandrovsky and Alexeyevsky schools formed the core of the anti-Bolshevik forces. The Red Guards eventually defeated the cadets but lost more than 1,000 fighters in the battles. Many streets in Moscow were heavily damaged. After Krasnov's failed attempt to capture Petrograd, a large group of Tsarist generals was arrested. Imprisoned in the city of Bykov, they did not attempt to escape, confident in their innocence and imminent rescue. But after the Bolsheviks captured Moscow, the prisoners' lives were in danger. They were freed by the Wild Division, loyal to Kornilov. Soon many found themselves in the Don region, where power was in the hands of Cossack ataman Kaledin, who did not recognize the Bolsheviks. Here, under the protection of the Don Cossacks, General Kornilov began forming a volunteer army from officers of the Tsarist army who had not broken their oath. Initially, its strength was only 4,000 people, united by a common hatred of the Bolsheviks. General Mikhail Alexeyev, the former chief of staff of the Stavka before the revolution, became the first commander of the volunteer army. But since he was terminally ill with cancer, command soon passed to Kornilov, leaving Alexeyev with civil and diplomatic work. The White Army was in dire need of weapons and ammunition. The military industry, concentrated in central Russia, was completely controlled by the Bolsheviks. The Whites turned to former allies who remained at war with Germany for help. The French, British, and Americans hesitated, unsure of which side to support and assist. Meanwhile, in December 1917, Bolshevik units moved towards the Don, gathering Red Guard detachments along the way. Soon, the so-called Echelon War began. There were no fronts yet. Battles were fought along the railways. Most provinces were engulfed in uprisings, supported by the small but highly mobile Red forces. The Cossacks remained the most reliable support of the empire due to tradition. Tsarevich Alexei was considered the ataman of the Cossacks from the age of 4. Well-trained and armed Cossacks formed the core of the emperor's guard. Thus, the Don Cossacks were a formidable opponent for the Bolsheviks. However, even on the Don, the Reds had sympathizers. Moreover, the alliance of Ataman Kaledin with the command of the volunteer army and politicians who fled from Petrograd was extremely unpopular here. These people, dreaming of reviving a strong and indivisible Russia, aroused hostility among the Don Cossacks, who stood for the creation of their own independent state. On January 10, 1918, at the Frontline Cossack Congress, Alexei Kaledin was stripped of his ataman power and soon shot himself. Lavr Kornilov decided to leave the Don and lead the volunteer army to the Kuban. Avoiding encounters with the increasingly numerous Red forces, Kornilov's army reached Yekaterinodar, the capital of the Kuban. This difficult march across the Kuban steppes went down in history as the Ice March. Kornilov attempted to capture Yekaterinodar but failed, losing 1,500 men killed. Early in the morning of April 13th, a stray shell hit the headquarters of the volunteer army, and Kornilov was killed. This absurd death was a major blow to the Whites. General Denikin, who took command, decides to move the troops away from Yekaterinodar. However, two key factors at that time aided the White Army: the rising anti-Bolshevik mood among the Kuban Cossacks and the Bolsheviks' hesitation, who didn't chase the enemy but instead dug up Kornilov's body and showed it around Yekaterinodar. Denikin returns to the Don. His army, with new volunteers, numbers only 3,500 in May, but by late 1918 it will pose a real threat to the Bolsheviks. Others also fought against the Reds. For instance, Colonel Alexander Dutov, leader of the Ural Cossacks. Yet the Red Army units managed to defeat Dutov. 27-year-old Vasily Blyukher in January 1918 establishes Bolshevik control in the southern Urals. The rebellion against the Bolsheviks in Transbaikalia, led by Ataman Grigory Semyonov, also failed. The Reds pushed Semyonov's forces into Manchuria. The first winter of the Civil War already brought suffering to all of Russia. Famine struck, killing the elderly and children first. As food supplies dwindled, lines at stores grew. Chaotic governance and a fuel crisis paralyzed the railroads. Despite desperate efforts, the Bolsheviks couldn't feed the cities. Half of the country's grain bypassed the state and went straight to the market. The Bolsheviks began to see private traders, known as bagmen, as enemies of Soviet power. Still, they had to allow private grain trade for now. At that moment, it was more crucial for the Bolsheviks to handle the white forces. The small, poorly trained, and undisciplined Red Guards couldn't win the war. In January 1918, a decree was issued to form the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. In March 1918, the Naval Affairs Commissariat was led by Leon Trotsky, who had previously managed international affairs not very successfully. When fighting on the Russo-German front paused in fall 1917 and talks began in Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky, sent by the Bolsheviks, opposed the Germans' terms and delayed the talks for 3 months. In February 1918, the Ukrainian Central Rada, expelled from Kyiv by the Red Guards, signed a treaty with Germany, allowing the Germans to liberate Ukraine and Crimea from the Bolsheviks. The Kaiser's troops took advantage, capturing Crimea, parts of Ukraine, and the Donbas. On February 18th, they started an offensive in Belarus, the Baltics, and towards Petrograd. They easily took over the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Their infantry reached Reval, Tallinn, a key Russian Navy base. However, 5 cruisers fired so effectively with their 10-inch guns that the Germans didn't dare enter the city. However, on February 25th, fleeing from the Germans, all ships of the Russian fleet, including 6 battleships and 5 cruisers, left Tallinn for Kronstadt. Although after capturing Pskov, the Germans stopped advancing, the Bolsheviks agreed to a humiliating, extremely disadvantageous peace treaty with Germany. The demarcation line moved far to the east. The Bolsheviks had to demobilize the Russian army, renounce claims to Lithuania, Poland, and Courland, and recognize the independence of Ukraine and Finland. Two weeks before the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the Germans entered Kiev. The German forces on the Eastern Front consisted of 74 divisions. Field Marshal Eichhorn commanded the front. The resistance of the Red units posed no threat to the Germans, and the old Russian army simply did not resist. In March 18 alone, the Germans captured over 80,000 soldiers and officers in Ukraine, along with a huge amount of weapons and ammunition. By April, the Germans had captured Odessa and reached areas bordering the Don. In Kiev, the government of Hetman Skoropadsky was established. It operated only with the knowledge of the German military command. Instead of the economic union with Germany that was dreamed of in Ukraine, fear and terror reigned here. Food was requisitioned and concentration camps were established. Partisan units began to appear in Ukraine. Moreover, their methods were less barbaric than those of the Germans. As for the north, the Germans advanced to the city of Narva in February. Although it was the last fortified line on the way to Petrograd, the Red units led by Pavel Dybenko and Alexandra Kollontai simply fled from Narva. For this, Dybenko was removed from his post as People's Commissar for Naval Affairs and put on trial. However, he served for a long time afterward. In the Red Army, he was considered a hero of the Civil War. The threat to Petrograd prompted Lenin's decision to move the Soviet government to Moscow, where the Bolsheviks also needed to strengthen their positions. By mid-March, the Bolshevik leadership and their families settled in the Kremlin. In the spring of 1918, Soviet power fell in the Don region. In May, the Don Rescue Circle elected General Krasnov as ataman. He ordered the execution of the leaders of the Don Revolutionary Committee. The Cossacks began selling food to the Germans. This allowed them to arm themselves well for the fight to free the Don from the Bolsheviks. But the Soviet power was threatened not only by the Cossacks. On March 6, 1918, the British cruiser Gloria entered the port of Murmansk. Formally, the task of the landing was to protect the city's military warehouses from the Germans. The city council, dominated by the Mensheviks, with the permission of the Council of People's Commissars, sanctioned the defense of Murmansk by the Allies on the condition that they do not interfere in the region's internal affairs. But the condition will be violated. Foreign warships also entered the far eastern ports of Russia. On April 5th, the Japanese anchored in Vladivostok. Soon, under the pretext of fighting terrorists, Japanese Marines and the British occupied the city. In a short time, the number of Allied troops in the Far East exceeded 90,000 people. 8,000 of them were Americans sent to support the Czechoslovak Corps. This corps sparked an anti-Bolshevik uprising in May 1918 on the Volga. Parts of the Corps moved along the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Far East, to then cross through America to the European front. The main body of Czechoslovaks was between the Volga and the Urals, in areas where Russian defense industries were evacuated. The corps, formed during the World War, mainly consisted of Czechs and Slovaks who surrendered to the Russians, numbering by the end of 1917. Nearly 40,000 soldiers and officers. When peace was signed with Germany, the Czech National Council declared the corps part of the French army. Czech nationalists, led by Tomáš Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, planned to use the corps in the fight for Czech independence. According to Masaryk's agreement with the Bolsheviks, the armed corps could freely pass through Siberia and evacuate to Europe. But just the word Siberia scared the Czechoslovaks, leading the anti-Bolshevik command to incite an uprising. The weak Bolshevik positions in Siberia helped the Czechoslovaks capture many cities along the Trans-Siberian Railway. In the uprising areas of the Czechoslovak Corps, anti-Bolshevik sentiments among Russians also intensified. Besides issues with the Germans and Don Cossacks, the Bolsheviks had to send troops east. However, the opening of the Eastern Front was preceded by many other events. In Crimea, occupied by the Germans, the Black Sea Fleet Command gets orders from the Bolsheviks to pull out the ships. Germany demands they be returned to Crimea. Then the Bolsheviks send another secret order to destroy the fleet. This was Lenin's directive, and the crews agreed to do it only when Lenin's personal emissary, Fyodor Raskolnikov, showed up. In Murmansk, at the end of June, a new British force of 2,000 men lands. At the same time, a fleet of 147 Allied ships nears Arkhangelsk. With the Whites' help, the Allies take the city. The number of Allied troops in the north is in the tens of thousands. All anti-Bolshevik forces gather around them. The Allied forces commander, General Poole, plans to move into Russia to join the Czechoslovak Corps with the White Army's support. But Poole's plan was unrealistic. The Allies didn't achieve much in the north. Still, their presence complicated Bolshevik relations with Germany and boosted anti-Bolshevik feelings in Russia. On July 3rd, a right-wing uprising started in Yaroslavl. The SRs, led by Boris Savinkov, a former notorious terrorist, were involved. The Reds only managed to crush the uprising with artillery support. By July 22nd, the city was in ruins. At the same time, the Bolsheviks had to deal with the left SRs, who revolted in Moscow during the Fifth Congress of Soviets. Unlike the Bolsheviks, who wanted peace with Germany at any cost, the left SRs were against it and demanded the Brest-Litovsk agreement be broken. After the assassination of the German ambassador in Moscow, Mirbach, on July 5th, the left socialist revolutionaries, led by Maria Spiridonova, staged an uprising. They managed to arrest Felix Dzerzhinsky and many other Bolshevik leaders, seize the Central Telegraph. But on the third day of fighting, the Red Latvian riflemen captured the headquarters of the left socialist revolutionaries. Over 300 people were taken prisoner, 13 of whom were later executed. The July uprisings were a vivid manifestation of the brutal struggle the Bolsheviks waged against their political opponents. These events confirmed the Bolsheviks' determination to eliminate all opponents of their revolutionary program. This was primarily the task of the 𝒀𝒂, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission since December 1917. It was headed by Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix. The 𝒀𝒂, and later the GPU and NKVD, would become the main instruments of political violence and terror. Symbolically, the Bolsheviks erected a monument to Robespierre, who said that the foundation of democratic governance is virtue, and the means to achieve it is terror. The organization led by Dzerzhinsky systematically destroyed those institutions and people who, in the Bolsheviks' view, were committed to the old order. Victims of 𝒀𝒂 terror didn't necessarily have to commit crimes against Soviet power. It was enough to pose a potential threat. The events that many see as a provocation by the 𝒀𝒃ists sparked the beginning of the Red Terror. In June 1918, the Commissar for Press Affairs, Volodarsky, was killed. In August, the head of the Petrograd 𝒀𝒂, Uritsky. The Bolsheviks' response was the execution of thousands of innocent people. The scale of the Red Terror became especially large after Lenin was wounded in Moscow at the end of August. The Bolsheviks' revenge became more organized, and the 𝒀𝒂's power became unchecked. The Red Terror sparked a massive retaliatory brutality from the Whites, allies of various bands. Violent death became commonplace in Russia. However, one execution shocked the country. The abdicated Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, who were under arrest in Yekaterinburg, were brutally murdered by local 𝒀𝒃ists on the night of July 17, 1918, with Moscow's consent, under the pretext that advancing white forces might free the former emperor. In the summer of 1918, the Reds' situation was dire. The territory of Soviet Russia was no larger than the ancient Moscow state. In the east, the Whites occupied all major cities, including Kazan. Troops of the anti-Bolshevik government formed in Samara, known as Komuch. The Committee of the Constituent Assembly, along with parts of the Czechoslovak Corps, entered Kazan without encountering resistance. The Serbian battalion defending the Kazan Kremlin betrayed the Bolsheviks. The Volga flotilla retreated upriver almost without firing a shot. In 1917, the provisional government transferred the country's gold reserves from Petrograd to Kazan. Now this gold was seized by the Whites and 𝒀𝒃s. However, the mere presence of the Whites in Kazan was far more dangerous for the Bolsheviks, as it opened a direct road to Moscow. From this moment, the Eastern Front becomes the main front of the Civil War. People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Leon Trotsky arrives in the Kazan area. This man, second only to Lenin in the Bolshevik hierarchy, had an unwavering belief in the correctness of the communist idea. He was able to instill this belief in others thanks to his rare oratorical skill. Trotsky's authority in the Red Army was immense. Later becoming Stalin's main opponent, Trotsky would be exiled from the country, and the name of this fiery revolutionary would long symbolize forces hostile to Bolshevism. All this, however, would come later. In the summer of 1918, Trotsky brought ammunition to the Red units near Kazan, and most importantly, revolutionary military discipline. Stalwart fighters received awards, deserters faced tribunals. Trotsky regrouped the troops and appointed new commanders. Joachim Vasiatis, commander of the Red Latvian Riflemen, took charge of the Eastern Front, and before that, a colonel of the Tsarist Army's general staff. He was one of the 75,000 Red commanders who had served under the Tsar, for whom the highest goal under any regime remained the defense of the fatherland. Trotsky was convinced that the young Red Army needed the experience and knowledge of military specialists. He also understood that military victories were impossible without high morale among the soldiers and strict discipline, which the Bolsheviks had successfully undermined in the army before the revolution. Entrusting command posts to Tsarist officers, Trotsky introduced the institution of political commissars in the Red Army, who controlled the execution of commanders' orders and the commanders themselves. As the Red Army's losses were enormous, the Bolsheviks began a campaign of mass recruitment and training of new recruits. During the Civil War years, about 5 million people went through the universal training courses and were then drafted into the active army. Near Kazan, the Red Army units achieved their first major victory. On September 10th, the troops of the Fifth Army and the ships of the Volga flotilla, supported by Baltic Fleet destroyers, captured Kazan. Trotsky regarded this victory as a significant combat example for the entire Red Army. Two days after the Reds secured the eastern bank of the Volga, Simbirsk fell. The road to Samara, the capital of the anti-Bolshevik Commuch government, was opened. Commuch was forced to urgently relocate to Ufa, but by November the Reds approached Ufa. The capture of Samara, the center of one of Russia's grain-rich regions, temporarily eased the Reds' severe food situation. However, hunger remained widespread. Russian peasants were unwilling to give their grain to the Bolsheviks for free. True to their principles, the communists introduced compulsory food requisitioning, known as 𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂, in May 1918. By the end of 1919, the food detachments numbered 70,000 people. They engaged in outright looting, the consequences of which were hunger and death in the villages. Attempts by peasants to resist were brutally suppressed. One of the extraordinary commissioners in the grain procurement and export sector was Joseph Stalin, sent to the North Caucasus in June 1918. Within a month, Stalin headed the military council of the North Caucasus Military District, whose main task was the defense of Tsaritsyn. However, it was not Stalin's merit that Tsaritsyn was defended from Krasnov's advancing troops. Stalin's role in the Civil War's military actions was generally greatly exaggerated. General Krasnov's units could not secure the Don without expelling the Reds from the nearest strategic center, Tsaritsyn. From September 1918 to January 1919, Krasnov surrounded the city 3 times but could not take it. He never succeeded. Tsaritsyn was sometimes called the Red Verdun. It cost the Bolsheviks enormous casualties. In the fall of 1918 alone, the defenders lost up to 60,000 killed. These losses were mainly due to the incompetence of Stalin and Voroshilov, who ignored the opinions of old-school military specialists. At the 8th Congress of the RCPB in March 1919, the so-called military opposition, represented by Stalin, Voroshilov, and their supporters, was criticized by Lenin himself. The Congress pointed out that dismissive attitudes towards military specialists and partisanship were unacceptable, and that the Red Army needed the iron discipline instilled by Trotsky. Both Stalin and Voroshilov would harbor lifelong hatred for Trotsky, the army reformer. The Red Army, quickly gaining combat experience and strength, had to face not only the Cossacks in the south in the summer and fall of 1918, Krasnov, but also Denikin's volunteer army. The general finally received the long-awaited help from the Allies. Reinforced with new weapons and personnel, Denikin began an offensive on Yekaterinodar, which the volunteer army had failed to capture the previous spring. Now Denikin managed to seize all the key and railway stations of the Kuban and cut off the center, Russia's Taman Red Army. Only with great difficulty, suffering heavy losses, this initially, 30,000-strong army would break out of the trap and join the main Red forces. On August 16th, Denikin's troops entered the capital of the Kuban. Soon, they also occupied Stavropol, the second-largest Kuban city. By the end of autumn, the Reds were pushed to the edge of the semi-desert steppe, which became a kind of mass grave for them. However, both the Whites and the Reds paid dearly for their victories. Among the dead was 30-year-old General Markov, one of Denikin's closest associates, commander of the 1st Officer Regiment and Infantry Division, which was later named after him. The Bolsheviks' position in the Transcaucasus was also desperate. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan declared their independence from Russia. However, the Turkish army posed a threat to them. In Baku, the city council decided to seek help from the British. They sent a small detachment in August, but a month later they left the city, and the Turks were able to establish themselves in Baku for a time. In Turkestan, Soviet power, proclaimed in November 1917, continued to hold in the central and eastern regions, in Tashkent, Pishpek, Verny, despite the fact that the Turkestan Republic was cut off from Russia by Dutov's Cossacks and the White Czechs. In 1918, the rulers of the Bukhara Emirate and the Khiva Khanate began to actively oppose the Soviets. Since local tradition prohibited mandatory conscription for permanent military service, forming Red Army units in Turkestan was difficult. Nevertheless, about 20,000 fighters were recruited into the Turkestan Army, but they had to be transferred to the Volga in 1918. At this time, thousands of miles away in Europe, major events are unfolding. On November 9th, to the delight of the Bolsheviks, a revolution occurred in Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated and fled to Holland. Germany declared itself a democratic republic. Workers' and soldiers' councils emerged everywhere, following Red Russia's example. A revolution also took place in Austria. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Hungary briefly became a Soviet republic. World War I ended, and the Germans began withdrawing troops from Ukraine. Field Marshal Eichhorn was shot. After Germany's defeat, the Allies focused on aiding the whites against the Bolsheviks. In November 1918, British and French ships entered the Black Sea. Landings occurred in Odessa and other Black Sea ports. The total number of Allied troops reached 130,000. In Vladivostok, where another contingent of Allies landed, there were over 150,000. Soldiers from Japan, England, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Serbia, China, Canada, Italy, and the USA were present. The newspaper or telegraph wrote then that victory over Germany, no matter how significant, couldn't be considered complete until Great Russia was liberated and restored. Japan showed particular activity in the Far East, aiming to strengthen its position on the Asian continent. But the USA sought to limit Japanese influence and increase its military presence in the region. By the end of 1918, all strategic objects of the Russian Far East were under Japanese and American control. Allied countries hurried to open their consulates here. The situation of Soviet Russia seemed utterly catastrophic to many at that moment. Its future appeared hopeless. The Bolsheviks were saved from total defeat by the lack of unity in the country and among their opponents, the support of the population who believed in promises of future happiness, and the policy of war communism, which allowed them to extract everything, from the country to the last. Russia's economy reached a critical state. Destruction, hunger, poverty, and epidemics reigned everywhere. Thousands of children were left without homes and relatives, forming an army of homeless. As a result of the battles, most railways were completely out of order. Quickly restoring them was impossible, which led to the shutdown of large enterprises and worsened the industrial crisis. Economic losses were hard to calculate, and human losses even harder. However, during the initial period of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks gained the most necessary thing to retain power: a numerically grown, strengthened, and combat-ready army. Script by Alexander Eisenberg, Maxim Zolotukhin, Judy Ball Bruce. Text by Judy Ball Bruce. Consultants Yuri Geller, Nikolai Mitrofanov. Producers Matthew King Kaufman, John Dukas, Maxim Zolotukhin. Directors Alexander Eisenberg, Matthew King Kaufman. Archival documents provided by the Central State Archive of Film and Photo Documents, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, the Teleradio Fund of Russia. Produced by Eastern Light. Close-up by Castle Communications. The film was voiced by NTV. Director Tatiana Maslova. Sound director Igor Sapozhnikov. Text read by Andrei Yaroslavtsev. This white guard chain's moved by the River with spirits and bacon. Started guard joints. Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to our intellectual popular science program, Cultural Context, about issues of culture, history, anthropology, philosophy, and sociology. My name is 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂. I am an anthropologist and associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Nazarbayev University. Today, we have as our guest a literary historian, a lecturer at the Department of Languages, Linguistics, and Literature at Nazarbayev University, and a specialist in Soviet literature, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂. Yulia, welcome to our program. Hello. 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, philologist, literary historian, specialist in the history of Soviet literature. In 2018 to 2019, she worked as an art historian at the Russian State Film Archive Gosfilmofond of the Russian Federation. In 2022, she defended her dissertation on Kazakh Soviet literature of the 1930s. From 2019 to 2022, she taught at the Faculty of Humanities at the National Research University Higher School of Economics. Since 2022, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 has been a lecturer at the Department of Literature Linguistics.